Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Stanford Center on Longevity Toolkit Series webinar, Life Planning in the Age of Longevity with Dr. Tamara Sims. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining us. I am Sasha Johnson-Fried, and I am a researcher at the center, and I'm also your host for today's Toolkit webinar with Dr. Sims. I want to start off by thanking some of the people and organizations that have made this series possible, including those listed here. And with that, I'd like to introduce our speaker. So Dr. Tamara Sims is a social personality psychologist interested in the intersection of culture, aging, emotion, and well-being. And she's a research scientist at the Stanford Center on Longevity and the director of the Sightlines Project, which she'll be talking about today. So welcome, Dr. Sims.
Thank you, Sasha, and thanks to all of you for being here today. I'm really excited to talk to you about some of the exciting work coming out of the center that I think has tons of implications for all of you as individuals, all of your clients, all of your employees, just Americans as a whole. And that's really thinking about life planning in this new age of longevity. So you might have recalled if you attended the webinar by Dr. Laura Carstensen that we are experiencing unprecedented increases in life expectancy. We've nearly doubled our life expectancy over the past 100 years. Sightlines, the project I'm going to be talking to you about today, was really born out of this phenomenon. So the previous webinar went into this, these increases in life expectancy and what that means for our society in much greater detail. But the Sightlines project is really looking at, okay, so if we are living longer, are we prepared for those long lives today? And it's really likely we might not be. So first, if we think about it from an evolutionary perspective, psychologically, the ways our brains are wired, we're not really equipped to think that far into the future. So it doesn't come as naturally to us to plan 30, 40 years ahead compared to planning for the next year or the next 5 years. And you might, think about interviews, and the really common interview question is, where do you see yourself in 5 years? Rarely do people ask, where do you see yourself in 40 years? We also culturally and as a society, we're not really keeping up with these changes. So there aren't really prescriptions for institutions and systems that support long lives. So while we experience these dramatic increases in life expectancy, we're not really designing lives in a way that addresses this. So you can think about our life milestones, and most of our life milestones are prescriptions for when you go to college, when you get married, when you buy your first home, when you start a family. And then there's sort of this big blank nebulous space where you work, and then you retire around age 65 or 62 or 70, depending on when you're going to claim your Social Security. And then it's sort of this whole lot of nothing. So even though we're living an additional 30 years, there aren't really milestones or prescriptions for what we do with those last 30 years. So that was really the impetus of this project that I'm going to be talking to you about today. Now, given that we're living these longer lives, we want to know, are people doing well with them? And again, just a quick refresher from the last webinar, if we look at today's older adult population, healthy aging is indeed a reality for many. So as people get older into their 60s, 70s, and 80s, people report being happier and more socially, have more socially meaningful relationships and emotionally meaningful experiences compared to younger people. And on average, this has been observed over and over and over again. We're talking about in different countries like Germany and China. If we look at this longitudinally and follow people over time, and many labs in psychology have found this effect. They refer to it as the paradox of aging, the idea that you might be experiencing physical decline, but your social and emotional well-being is improving. So this has gotten a lot of press. A lot of people talk about it. And I stumbled across this letter to the editor not that long ago, and it really caught my attention. So somebody was talking about this effect of aging and emotional well-being in the news. And this person responds, really? The happiest time in your life is when you are 82 to 85 years old? I don't think so. Where did those researchers find those octogenarians? I certainly have not met them. People I know in this age group and younger are fighting the battle of an aging body. Happiness for a senior is having a week without a doctor's appointment. As a 77-year-old, I don't know anyone my age or older who would say this is the happiest time of his or her life. And I think this is a really important remark, because you could think of your own lives, and there might be people you see that are doing phenomenally well, but then there are people who are really struggling. And I think this is often overlooked in this research, that while we say on average older people are happier than younger people, there is substantial variation in people's wellness in old age, and many subgroups of the population. For example, if you compare people with high levels of education versus those with high school or less education, educated people tend to do better on average across the lifespan than people with less education. So there are definitely subgroups of the population that aren't experiencing these improvements in well-being. So this means that they're great targets for interventions, and we need to figure out how can we enhance quality of life for everybody across the entire adult lifespan. So what we do in our project is we really focus on actions that you can take in your daily life that we know, based on evidence and research around the globe, predict how long you live and how well you live. So I think that's a really important point, is that we're not just talking about adding years to life, we're talking about adding quality years to life. So as part of the Sightlines project, we compiled the list of the most important factors we know lead to healthy, long lives. And then we further distilled these factors to what we call actionable items. So we know, for example, that the zip code of your birth, where you're born, has a strong effect on how well you live and how long you live. But unfortunately, there's nothing you can do about that. So we really focus on things that you could do today in your daily life to make a difference. And so here I think it's also important to talk about wellness, and what we mean by healthy long life is broadly construed. So we look at three major domains: healthy living, financial security, and social engagement. And I think all of you at some point in your life, like as individuals, you're thinking about healthy living. In your companies, you're probably thinking about this to improve, employer productivity, to improve well-being at home. With financial security, this has always been in the forefront of research when you're thinking about planning for a long life. What's relatively understudied is social engagement, even though we know that social engagement or social isolation is just as strong a predictor of long, healthy lives as smoking. So it's just as important, but often not looked at. So this was sort of one of the novel pieces of this project, is that we really wanted to look at this comprehensively and include all these domains that we know are important to long, healthy lives. So you'll see with healthy living, there's things like exercising, sedentary behavior, alcohol consumption. Financial security is managing debt, so sort of your cash flow, your asset growth, so retirement savings, protection, things like health and life insurance. And for social engagement, we sort of have these two categories of meaningful relationships and group involvement. The meaningful relationships are things really like your friends and your family, your spouse, partner, and then group involvement is more external facing. So things like, are you working? This is an interesting one, because we're looking at working as a way that you stay socially connected or engaged, as opposed to a way of building financial security. Also volunteering and participating in your communities. So you've heard in the news about people living longer lives, and Americans on the whole are really aware that they are living longer than previous generations, but there's this disconnect between Americans' beliefs about their longevity and the decisions they're making today. So are they taking these actions? And many are not. So what we wanted to do as as part of the Sightlines project is really look, okay, what % of Americans are engaging in these actions across the whole adult lifespan, to understand if today Americans are preparing and planning for these longer lives. So you can see here, for example, for healthy living, a little bit more than half of Americans are doing it right, quote unquote, in healthy living. That means they're sort of engaging in the actions I showed you earlier at sort of the recommended amounts or prescribed levels by experts in that industry. We break down these findings by age groups for a few reasons. So one is obvious. We want to know the different needs of each generation, but another is to see who is struggling most. So you can see here, for example, that older boomers, the 65 to 74-year-olds in healthy living, are probably the ones who are in need of most intervention. They're not doing as well as their younger boomer counterparts. For financial security, this might be a bit more of an obvious takeaway, but the younger generations of millennials, which are 25 to 34-year-olds here, are doing the worst in terms of financial security. That might be that they'll eventually catch up with everybody just as a result of age, and this graph doesn't tell us that. And then finally, for social engagement, in general, people aren't doing so hot in social engagement, but we can really look to our 35 to 44-year-olds to see what they're doing as a way of potentially improving social engagement for the other groups. My money right now is on the probability that they're really engaging. We haven't broken this down by parents and people without children, but engagement in schools and communities through their children's activities. So that's sort of yet to be seen, and it's something we're sort of interested in doing going forward. So stay tuned. Another important reason we look at these groups is we can sort of make these direct comparisons, but dig down more into each construct. So as I showed you before, healthy living is really broken down by these 9 different actions. And we want to see what is sort of driving the findings we're seeing in healthy living. So we saw, millennials were sort of doing pretty well compared to the older boomers, and what is it they're doing well on. And what's interesting about healthy living is you can see that even though they might have been doing pretty well relative to some other groups, they clearly need help in certain areas. They're still not exercising enough, a good chunk of them. A good chunk aren't getting enough sleep, and the majority of them don't eat enough fruits and vegetables. Now, if we zoom in on Generation X here we're defining as our 35 to 44-year-olds, although we're making these distinctions, or sort of fuzzy distinctions, and in terms of what comprises a generation. Typically 2 chunks of these age groups will comprise a generation, but here, so for here it's the 35 to 54-year-olds, so we combine the 2 age groups. And so what we see with Gen Xers is smoking isn't as bad as the younger generation with the millennials, but there are similar issues of obesity and sleep. And exercise is an even bigger problem for Gen Xers than for millennials, with half of them reporting not getting the recommended amounts of physical activity. And then if we focus in on boomers' health, and you break these down by their different action steps, you see that there's a similar pattern that emerges, but sleeping and smoking isn't as problematic compared to Generation Xers, and exercise is the most problematic relative to all younger generations. So what this is telling us is that, we can kind of make these overarching generalizations about how Americans are doing in healthy living, but when you start to break it down by the generations, by the different age groups, by the different action items, a very complicated story emerges. But what's important about the complexity here is that it helps us identify the areas where we can intervene, right? So if I tell you, oh, here are boomers doing well on healthy living, or millennials doing well on healthy living, and you assume, okay, they're doing well, I don't have to worry about them. But when you break it down, you realize, well, there are aspects of healthy living we do need to worry about. And then similarly with boomers, if we're saying, oh, they're not doing so hot, but then when you break it down, you realize, oh, it's really driven by, their diet and their exercise. So it's informative in those ways as well. Now, what I've been showing you is sort of like one static time point. How are each of these generations doing, and how are they doing relative to each other? But it's difficult to know, given what we said. We know that there are advances in life expectancy. People are becoming more aware of this. We have a big aging population. So things are shifting and changing in a very quick way. And so it's difficult to really understand how well we're doing and whether we're on the right or wrong track unless we have a comparison point to previous generations. And so that's another novel piece of this project that is rarely done, is looking at all of these age groups, but then comparing these age groups today to those same age groups back over historical time. So looking back 10, 15, 20 years ago. So how are millennials doing today compared to the 25 to 34-year-olds 15 years ago or 20 years ago? So you can see here then, if you look at healthy living, there's actually very little change over time. People are doing, on average, across all those 9 action items, and remember to keep in mind that these sort of vary quite a bit, that people, despite huge public health campaigns, Michelle Obama's push on diet, a lot of physical activity interventions that are being implemented at really large scales, so either through organizations or at the national level, there's very little movement in healthy living on average. In financial security, this shouldn't surprise any of you that people took a huge hit, particularly the younger generations, in financial security from 2000 to 2014. So the young generations aren't doing nearly as well today as they did pre 9/11 and pre the financial crisis. For social engagement, we see some dips overall in social engagement. The most striking finding, and I think one of the most compelling findings of this entire study this initial study we did, is that if you look at the 55 to 64-year-olds, oh, I forgot I could use my cursor, so I'm going to use that to draw your attention here, is there's far fewer 55 to 64-year-olds, so today's boomers, that feel socially engaged compared to those 55 to 64-year-olds back in 1995. And we'll dig into that a little bit more further down the road. So what I want to do is for each of these focus in on a couple particular actions. So first we'll start with healthy living, and I just want to remind you of what the 9 action steps are. So I want you to think about it for yourself, for your family, your friends. Think about, do you get a sufficient amount of physical activity? So the recommended amount of 30 minutes a day for several days a week. Are you maintaining a healthy weight? How often are you sitting in a day? Do you sit more than 5 hours a day? And do you sit for extended periods of time without getting up and walking around? How often do you eat the recommended amount of 5 servings of fruits and vegetables a day? Are you getting at least 7 hours of sleep every night? Are you drinking more than the recommended amount of alcohol? Do you use tobacco or nicotine or illicit drugs? So just to take a beat here, I want you to think specifically about diet. So I want you to answer for me yes or no. Do you in your daily life eat at least 5 servings of fruits and vegetables every single day? So one of the issues with this, you might be realizing as you're answering the question, is it's a hard question to answer. That's the common response I get. What's a serving? What qualifies as a vegetable every day? Is it what if I do it 6 days and on the 7th day I sort of go nuts and don't eat any fruits and vegetables? Is that sufficient? And that's one of the problems with this measure. It's the most commonly used measure in the largest nationally representative surveys around the country, but it's not by any stretch the best measure. And we're currently working on developing better assessments of diet in collaboration with some of our faculty affiliates in nutrition here at the center for future work. So here we see, wow, you guys are really healthy. Okay, so I'm so happy to see this. You made my day. 78% of you said yes, you eat the recommended amount of servings of fruits and vegetables every day. And the reason I'm surprised is while I make every effort and I'm sort of in an area that's, pretty healthy, I'm here in the Bay Area, that, oh, sorry. Oh, there we go. That if you look here, we show the percentage of Americans eating at least 5 fruits and veggies every day. 24% of all Americans would have answered that question as yes, which to me was striking and disheartening. If you look at this by education, you'll see that the inner circle's college graduates, outer circle's high school graduates. People with a college education are more likely, but it's fewer than a third still. Among men and women, women are more likely, but again, only about a third. And this is actually really prevalent, even if you break it down. So I mentioned that I live in the Bay Area, and around here, around Stanford, everybody must eat well. But actually, if you look at California, which the darker the colors means the more people are eating the recommended amounts of fruits and veggies. And you'll see that California is among the highest, but it's still only about a third of Californians are eating the recommended amount. So clearly here, we're seeing that there's lots to be done in this space. One, in terms of how we measure it, but two, in terms of how we can get people to eat more healthy. And one of our affiliates is working on an intervention at more of the system level. He found it was very difficult to get people at the individual level to change their diet. So instead, he's working with the Culinary Institute of America. This is Dr. Christopher Gardner, in case you're interested in looking him up. And they're developing what they call menus of change. So working with institutions and restaurants to change what their offerings are on their menu, and that might help improve consumption of healthier food. Now, one thing I mentioned earlier was that the college educated eat more fruits or more of them eat fruits and veggies than non-college educated. And for most of the findings in Sightlines, we do see education as sort of this protective factor. It enhances your likelihood of engaging in all of these actions. With the exception, one major exception is sedentary behavior. And you guys, I'm assuming some of you are nodding your heads, or at least thinking about nodding your heads, because if you think about the types of jobs we have, they encourage sitting. We're at computers all day long. So you can see here, regardless of age, so if you compare it every single age group, those who have a college education are more likely to sit for 5 or more hours a day than those who have less than a high school education. And I think this is largely likely due to the type of work that was being done, and then the lifestyle that type of work promoted even outside of the workplace. So next, I want to shift gears to focus a little bit on financial security. That's to say, there's a lot more data on healthy living on our website, so I welcome you to peruse it, and you can definitely ask me questions at the end, but also feel free to email me anytime if you want to discuss particular findings in more depth. But for financial security, again, we have these sort of 9 actions people can engage in. And again, think about this for yourselves. Your threshold income, how far above the poverty line are you? Do you have what's your level of manageable debt? Do you have access to at least $3,000 in case of an emergency? Do you save for retirement? Do you have other types of investments? Do you own a home, which is a really hot topic right now, and one where we sort of have a special feature on our website about homeownership currently. Health insurance is a little tricky these days, so I won't go into that so much right now. But there's also this idea of having long-term disability or care and life insurance as ways to sort of protect your assets. So as I mentioned, home ownership is sort of the hot topic. So I wanted to ask all of you first to consider what age you bought your first home. And this is important to consider, given I don't know your age or what generation most of you are in right now. I would gather that many of you are not millennials. And the big question right now is sort of, when millennials are buying homes, are they ever going to? And I'll go into a little bit more detail about that in a second. And so we can see that the majority of you bought your first home between 25 and 34 years old. And so if we move to, oh, sorry, there we go, to the Sightlines findings, we see 62% of Americans own a home. You're more likely to own a home if you're married versus unmarried. That's probably not surprising. And also not surprising is if you're 65 to 74 years old, you're more likely to own a home than a 25 to 34-year-old, despite the fact that most of you said you bought your first home between 25 and 34. But what's difficult about interpreting these findings is, okay, yeah, the 65 to 74-year-olds have a home, but who knows when they actually bought it. And so it's sort of like comparing apples to oranges, right? So we sort of dug a little deeper into this finding, and we used a different nationally representative data set where we looked at people. You'll see on the bottom it says 79 cohort and 97 cohort. 79 cohort are people who were teenagers in 1979, so these are our baby boomers. And in 1997, these were teenagers at that time, and these they're like our older millennials. And what we did was we looked at their likelihood of having a home at age 30, so that we could do more of an apples to apples comparison and see, okay, boomers at age 30, millennials at age 30, who owns a home. And then we want to break it down by education level, because we thought, well, we might be seeing some disparities with millennials in home ownership, but maybe that's really for people who didn't achieve a college education, for example. So it's sort of an affordability issue in terms of the types of jobs they're getting. But what we actually see is, regardless of education, you see that boomers on the left were significantly more likely to own a home than millennials on the right, regardless of education. So education, it does increase your chances of having a home by age 30, but to a much lesser degree for millennials. Millennials' education isn't buying them as much as it did for baby boomers. This raises a whole host of questions. Most of you probably have seen a lot in the news about this, and it makes you wonder, okay, so it could be affordability of, housing prices are really expensive. It could be that people have more student loan debt and other debt than ever before, so millennials just can't afford homes for that reason. It could be that, even among the college educated, it's just that they're getting more education, they're taking longer getting education, so they haven't yet purchased a home. But there's another interesting possibility that we're currently looking into right now. We just finished a survey to tackle this question: is, do younger people even want to buy homes anymore? So, we're sort of making the assumption that with all of these action steps that they're good for you and they're important for long, healthy lives. This is all based on generation collected from previous generations. And for millennials, is homeownership the key to, financial security in long life, or are they going to find other ways to invest their money because the real estate market is more tenuous, or they simply don't want the commitment of purchasing a home? So we're sort of looking into some of these possibilities by looking at when people actually buy their homes, and then when they ideally want to buy their home, to see if millennials, do they want to be buying a home by age 30, or do they want to wait and be buying one by age 40? But what's important about that is that generation is going to be the one to live likely the longest in retirement years, depending on if they do retire. And so they might need some sort of equity in the real estate market more than any other generation previous. But in that case, only time will tell. And also with this, stay tuned for our findings from the current project that we're doing. So if we move on to social engagement, this is what I mentioned earlier, the most understudied. It was difficult for us to find national surveys that tap into social engagement at the same size as financial security and health. So we're also developing our own survey to go a little bit deeper into this domain in the future. But again, I want you to think about your own experiences here, you know, how often you interact with your friends and your family. Do you feel like you can rely on your friends and family for support? Do you have meaningful interactions with your spouse or partner? One of, I think, the most interesting findings of this project is that men report having more meaningful interactions with their spouse or partner than women. And this, to me, raises a question of perhaps men and women define meaningful interactions a little bit differently. I'm sure that's pretty accurate. So for group involvement, are you currently working? Odds are that if you're taking this webinar, you are. Do you volunteer? Do you participate in community or religious activities? Do you converse with your neighbors? This is a really timely question, given that people are less connected with their neighbors. So if you ask yourself, do I know my neighbor? Do I ever see my neighbor? Do I say hi to my neighbor? It's becoming more and more common over time. Now, what I mentioned at the very beginning was we saw this sort of dip with baby boomers especially, and that was across all those measures. So if we go back, so for these metrics of social engagement, for all of them, for almost all of them, other than workforce participation, you'll see that boomers sort of took a dive across the board. So it wasn't that any one particular action step was driving that finding. So recently, Laura Carstensen wrote a article for Time Magazine addressing this finding that baby boomers are isolating themselves. And we've been thinking about this a lot. Like I said, it's a very compelling finding, mostly because it was unexpected. But there are a few issues with this. One is that the measures we had, if you notice, we're comparing 1995 to 2012. And in 1995, there was no measure of social media. So we don't know whether, is it that baby boomers are less socially engaged just in general, or is it that they're using other means of engagement? Are they just supplementing their interactions with social media platforms, for example? So that's one possibility. But in general, we've been thinking about ways that we can help offset the social isolation too. So not just like what are the reasons for it, but what are the ways that we can sort of intervene to help segments of the US population like baby boomers that are struggling with social engagement. And it's pretty difficult to intervene with connections to family and friends, but encouraging community involvement might be sort of a more feasible way to have some impact. So in terms of community involvement, I sort of want to ask all of you, in the past year, did you volunteer for an organization? Yes or no? Volunteering in general has been showing, as you're answering this, I don't want to influence your response, but to say that it's been associated with tremendous health benefits, both physical health and mental health. And in particular, when people sort of start to enter retirement age. So we have this growing older adult population, this tremendous source of human capital that we could be tapping into to help younger generations that are in need. And we're not doing as much as we should be doing in that space. And recently there's been a huge movement in that direction, fortunately. So 80% of all of you have volunteered for an organization, and I would say by no means are you representative of the American population, much like your responses to diet. So you can see here that only 26% of Americans answered yes to this question. You see a huge difference between college graduates, who are the inner circle, and people with no high school degree. So college graduates, 40% of them reported volunteering in the past year, and women are slightly more likely than men to volunteer. One of the issues I forgot to mention earlier with this volunteering is we said for an organization, but what's interesting about this is it doesn't take into account more informal volunteering. So say you're caring for a family member at home, or you're babysitting your sister's kids. This particular survey doesn't tap into that, but in the future we sort of want to compare not just rates of formal and informal volunteering, but whether there are different benefits to each of them. But in general, there is tremendous need to improve volunteering rates in the United States. And you can actually see, if we look at this across the US, and when I'm showing you these maps, this is across all age groups, you'll see that in general, most people, only, again, about a third of people to a quarter of people are reporting volunteering, with the exception of Utah. So if you look, Utah sort of sticks out like a sore thumb. And what I think is important here is if we can look to a state like Utah, where we know that their Mormonism is highly prevalent, and as part of that religion and that culture, volunteering is a social norm. It's normative, it's expected, and that might be key to enhancing volunteering around the country. Is if we can make this a more normative behavior and implement it into institutions and organizations at that level, so through companies, through school programs, and have it be sort of a default that you are expected to volunteer as part of your job or as part of your schooling, we might be able to get to the point, the level that Utah is at in terms of volunteering rates. So this was just sort of an overview, of a little taste of the Sightlines project. It's really the tip of the iceberg. There is a ton more in terms of the findings that we have available to look through, but as well as what we want to do in the future. So again, I want to encourage you to stay tuned and reach out to me if you're interested in participating. But I want to sort of review the take-home points, which is that living long and living well is most realistic for people who adopt healthy behaviors, are socially engaged, and build financial security. This is, like I said, all based on evidence around the globe. These action steps that we've highlighted in the Sightlines project are low cost and high yield. So we know they have a huge impact on people's lives. And there's not much, like as an individual, that you'd have to do to take steps to engage in them. Granted, we're not ignoring environmental constraints and other factors that might make it more difficult for some than others, but they're all possible to take action in today. The issue is that many Americans aren't taking these actions today, and that's especially true in vulnerable populations, based on pretty much what I just said, that there are certain environments. So if we take food deserts, for example, where there's only a liquor store within a 10-mile radius, it might make it difficult for somebody to eat a healthy diet. So this tells us that although these are individual actions, we need to intervene not just at the individual level, but at this organizational and institutional levels as well. The challenges to behavior change are prevalent and varied, but there are many opportunities for organizations to promote these action steps. So when you're thinking about ways to help your clients or your employees or your friends or family, it's really important to think about these key factors when helping people prepare for longer, better lives. Different life stages have different sets of challenges, whether you're looking at children, which we will be doing in the future as part of this project, or Generation X or baby boomers. Subpopulations matter in terms of who has the most need and what types of barriers they're facing, which are likely very different if you're looking at different levels of education, men versus women, different levels of income or ethnicity. And then it's really important to consider all aspects of health. It's not enough just to think about healthy behaviors like smoking and exercise, or financial security like investing and home ownership. We also need to be considering social engagement and ensuring that people are staying connected to their family, friends, and community. So these are just, in the spirit of the webinar, some action steps that you can think about doing today. So one is to learn about and be aware of shifting life expectancies, and that these vary for different subgroups. So not everybody on average is living to 84. So how can we think about, if you're thinking about planning for retirement, for example, some people may be planning for a longer retirement than others. We need to realistically prepare for longer retirements and longer lives by assessing costs and potential equity acquired by living longer. We need to go beyond money by improving healthy behaviors and building, this is sort of Steve's term, which I love, diversified, robust social portfolios. So not just your financial portfolio, but your social one as well. And then we can explore ways to influence positive change. And based on some of the research done at the center and around Stanford, one with the Sightlines project, we want to look to groups who are on the right track to learn from them and identify strategies that can help those on the wrong track. We can combine facts and strategies. So all the deep data I gave you here that might be sufficient to help motivate some people, like wearing a Fitbit or wearable, knowing how many steps you took might be motivation enough, but a lot more people usually need more motivation and inspiration at the individual level beyond facts and figures. And then finally, considering social norms and default options, and implementing meaningful incentives. Sometimes financial incentives aren't sufficient, and there needs to be something more meaningful at the organizational and institutional level. So, thanks.
Yeah, thank you so much, Tamara, for that presentation. And I want to just field some questions from our audience. And so one question that's come in is, how can employers encourage these actions that you're speaking about, for employees of different ages? So if you have a workforce with many employees, what can they do across the lifespan?
Yeah, I think that's one of the huge takeaways of the Sightlines project. Is it's going to be really difficult, I think, to develop an intervention where you're going to be able to be effective across ages, and you might need to develop more age-specific interventions. That being said, if you notice, diet is a really good example of one that, oh man, it's robust. It doesn't matter, other than I think 75-plus-year-olds actually do better than any other age group, but otherwise most other age groups, nobody's eating enough fruits and vegetables. So for an example like that, you can use something like Sightlines to sort of inform, okay, what sorts of, if I want to intervene with a healthy diet, great, I can do that sort of across a lifespan and find ways to have, healthy foods in your vending machines, and, healthy food options in the vendors and restaurants, around your organization. But then there are these other ones, for example, like physical activity. Certainly you don't want to be recommending the same types of physical activity to millennials versus boomers. So while you should be encouraging physical activity across the lifespan, for example, if you're in very long meetings, getting people to stand up and normalizing not engaging in sedentary behavior would be a really important way to offset that issue. And I think workplaces have huge potential impact with sedentary behavior. If you've ever thought about sitting in a meeting for an hour and even my Fitbit will go off and tell me to get up, but I don't feel like I can get up because it would be disruptive to the meeting. So if you sort of put those breaks in there, or have walking meetings, I think that's a really sort of low-hanging fruit for an intervention at an organization. But again, there are these other ones where I don't think there's an easy answer. I don't think you can just promote healthy behaviors for a multi-generational workforce. I think you would have to develop ways to target millennials that are different from ways to target older adults. We have a lot of work in out of Laura Carstenson's lab that shows that even the way you frame the way you frame messaging to promote certain behaviors, it's more effective if you sort of frame the costs of not engaging in a behavior for young people, while it's more effective to frame a behavior as the benefits of engaging in it for older people. So if you think about just off the top of my head, I'm going to say flossing just because there's a study on this, but you can say, you know, floss to prevent gum disease, or floss to have, you know, healthier gums. And the healthier gum message is going to be more effective for older people, where the gum disease message will be more effective for younger people.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I didn't know that finding. So, yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Sims, for this presentation. Unfortunately, that's the only question we have time for, but thank you. And so to our attendees, I want to let you know about some of our upcoming webinars. So in May, we have the webinar Understanding Longevity with Steve Vernon, and that's on May 10. And in June, we have a webinar on financial fraud with Marty DeLiema. So I encourage you to register for those. That'll be hopefully very useful discussions. So with that, Tamara, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
And for attendees, that is it, and that is the end of the webinar.